So as Emma said, I'm Dr. David Moffat, and I'm going to be talking about an introduction to machine learning for Earth observation. I was going to do a slide introducing myself, but Emma did such a good job. I don't think there's really very much to add, other than that I'm part of the NERC Earth Observation Data Acquisition and Analysis Service. So that's funded by the UK government to do specific Earth observation and some AI work as part of that within the UK. And I'm based at Plymouth Marine Laboratory, and that's what Emma was saying. So I thought today it would be useful to start off with a little bit of disambiguation. There's a lot of language that's used around artificial intelligence at the moment, and in general there's a lot of different language, and some of the terms that are used can sometimes be a bit confusing, complex, and it's quite important to delineate with what we mean. So artificial intelligence is very popular at the moment. It's been in lots of news stories, and I'm sure you've heard quite a bit about it. But artificial intelligence is quite a broad category, and that covers many, many different things that sit across a whole wealth of different computer science domains. So this typically means that we're trying to build some sort of thing that looks intelligent and is artificial. So you create an artificial system that looks intelligent. And the way we typically tend to measure intelligence is, does it look intelligent in a human-like way? Does it do something in the way that humans can evolve? Intelligence has its whole branch of philosophies and things like that. So there's a lot of debate as what is intelligence and what's not, and can you find intelligence in the natural world through swarms and colonies and that sort of thing. But taking the broadest sense possible, does it look like it's doing something more clever than a very simple linear system, essentially? Within that, machine learning is a subset. So one of the artificial intelligence approaches is machine learning. And machine learning is a specific approach which is looking at using statistics and using data. And the idea is we're learning an awful lot from data to learn something specifically. So we're cycling through, and we're not, in artificial intelligence, we might be building deterministic approaches that then look clever when you combine a series of different drones or single-celled automata together. Whereas with machine learning, you're trying to build something that we use mostly statistics and some probability to try and understand a set of data that you have. And deep learning is something that's also quite commonly used interchangeably with machine learning, but deep learning is really a subset of that machine learning again. Deep learning is quite a novel in the area of application. So this is where you can really take some specific machine learning algorithm, and this is where you start looking at things like neural networks, where you have large structures of data, and it's considered deep because the idea is you're adding more and more layers of complexity as you add these structured data together. I'll go into that into a little bit more detail in a few slides' time, but just the idea is that deep learning is a subset of what machine learning is. So I just think it's important to clarify some of those individual points. So what is machine learning? Machine learning is fundamentally learning from data. So it's essentially a situation where you are looking at trying to learn something without programming it explicitly. So in a traditional sort of programming environment, you would have some data, and then you would write some computer program, and you would pass both of these into your computer, and then you get that to do some sort of output. So this would be something you've probably seen in all of the other talks that you've had, where you're gathering some data from some EO source, you have some program, some sort of algorithm that has been developed, and you're combining those two things within a piece of hardware, and then you have some output result. Well, in machine learning, we turn that on its head, and we essentially say, but what if we don't know this program, but we know what we want as an output and as an input? And so essentially what we have is we have our data input, we have some output, and we combine them together into our computer, and we ask the computer, develop us the program that we want to use. So we're essentially taking the data that we have, and just that data that we have, and we're instilling it into the computer, and we're asking that to develop some program that we can then use. And then you could put it into a more traditional pipeline where you've got this machine learning developed program that you could then use for any of your sort of traditional processing. So machine learning is purely learning from data. And there's a number of different approaches that you can take with machine learning. So there's some traditional machine learning approaches, and these are ones that are typically have been commonly used more than about 10 or 15 years ago. and this is before the sort of large uptake in deep learning that's been happening. So these traditional machine learning approaches, you have some data, you apply some sort of normalization step to it where you're scaling your data, and then you look at your individual features that you might have. So in a NEO context, that might be some particular bands, or you might be looking at identifying bands that are relevant, calculating some indices, and manipulating your data so that you're looking for particular elements. And then you do some model selection. And so that's essentially looking at your machine learning approach, your machine learning algorithm that you want to use. And I've listed a few different ones here. So you've got random forests, you've got support vector machines, you've got dbScan, NFFT, SNE. But the fundamental point is that you've got some deterministic algorithm where you're essentially trying to identify, say you've got two clusters of data, you're trying to identify some definitive boundary or some sort of classification or some sort of approach to try and separate them out. And it's all built through taking very particular step-by-step approaches to look at how you might apply a particular machine learning method to that data. And then, in comparison to that, you've got the more recent developments, or deep learning. And deep learning, as I was saying earlier on, is this is where you have these much more complex structures. And in this case, you've got a lot more model design and a lot more hyperparameters to tune. You also need a lot more hardware. So with these things, you'll typically need a lot more supercompute or some sort of GPU graphic processing units. So you need a lot more compute power to be able to run these. But the idea is that each one of these, you've got a series of individual nodes, and then all these nodes are connected. So this structure is quite often called a neural network. And the idea originally being, this was drawn from how people understood the brain structure to work, or human brains to work. The idea that you have individual neurons, which would be at each of these dots or these circles, and then all these different connections. So lots of different neurons are connected to lots of different other neurons, and then the idea is that they can communicate with each other. And so each individual line is going to have some weight function, and each individual dot or each individual neuron is going to have some very small, very simple function applied within it. So that could be essentially a bit like one of the individual traditional machine learning approaches. It could be something as simple as a linear regression within each node, and then you would apply that multiple times. And as you go through layers and layers, or what we call hidden layers, which are these layers in the middle, so you put some data in right at this very front, and then you go through all these layers, which you never see from the outside, they're all hidden inside, and then you have some output prediction. And the idea is it's deep because you're combining more and more layers of data, more and more layers of complex machine learning together. And then as you go deeper and deeper, the idea is that you can learn more complex structures from the data that you have. Coupled with that, and across both of them, we also have this concept of supervised versus unsupervised learning. So supervised learning is where we have some specific labels, and therefore we're trying to learn from a particular label. So for example, you have some data and you know that all of these data points are blue and all of these data points are red, and then you're trying to learn some idea of how I could separate these data points apart. So you might be trying to identify some boundary so that you can do some classification. Is this a red or is this a blue? And you're looking at the data that you have, at the feature space that you have, and you're trying to identify a boundary. Whereas unsupervised learning is where you have no data whatsoever. So all of these would originally be colored the same color, and you're doing, in this case, a cluster analysis. So you're saying, oh, what clusters do I have? And let's cluster all of them together. And so we can see that we're getting slightly different results in this, and that you can see that these are clear clusters, but if we look at our labeled data, some of these points don't necessarily agree with our original labels, but you can understand that they might be different. So supervised learning is where you have some labels, something to represent your data. And it's supervised because essentially you are then saying, oh, okay, this is the target that I want you to reach. So it's a bit like you having a teacher marking you every single time and supervising you as you learn. When it's unsupervised, all the machine learning algorithm is doing is looking at all the data that you have and trying to understand the meaning of the data itself without any instruction, without any other information other than the raw data that you have. So a good example of unsupervised learning would be cluster analyses, whereas a supervised learning would be a classification. Machine learning often suffers from this concept of a black box problem. So as I was saying earlier, we've got this traditional approach where we have data and a program and we expect an output, whereas with machine learning, we've got data and an output, and then it gives us a program. But this program, it's often challenging to interrogate. It's really difficult to understand what's going on within this model, to identify where it fails, and to really understand what this program that you're doing is, particularly when you look at the larger structures, such as the deep learning models, because you've got quite a lot of complexity, it's very difficult and can be quite unintuitive to understand exactly what's going on. And so there's work that you need to do to really try and get into that. And there's a couple of entire fields of research that are trying to answer some of these problems. One of them is explainable AI, where you can try and open up a model and look at different components and justify why things are happening. And the other one is adversarial AI. And adversarial AI is basically where you're building another AI to try and break whatever program you've got, to try and find the edge cases or the situations where your machine learning model is wrong and where you can force it to do something weird. So this is a really good example of adversarial AI, where you can take a picture of an apple and you can see we get very, very good classification accuracy that this is a Granny Smith apple. But if we just write a piece of paper that says iPod in front of it, then all of a sudden this machine learning algorithm is confident that this is an iPod. And this is an example of adversarial AI, where you're trying to find a way of breaking the algorithm that you have, because it's getting confused, thinking, oh, well, this is now an Apple iPod. So it's making some incorrect assumptions, whereas I don't think any human would ever describe this as an Apple iPod without an amount of sarcasm. So which machine learning methods should I use? I think this is always quite an important thing to discuss. A lot of people are always wanting to jump to the brand new, most complicated thing, and everyone wants to be doing neural networks, but sometimes there are cases where it's just not appropriate and it's also not necessary. So this is a report that came out of some UK government research, which was essentially looking across a whole series of domains, from language processing, from vision processing. I don't think there was any Earth observation in this particularly, but it tried to cover a whole massive range of domains, even medical applications. And essentially, this is the really important corner of it, down in the bottom left-hand corner here, where you can see that it's essentially the amount of data that you have. If you have quite a small amount of data, then a traditional machine learning method will work really well. And as you get more and more data, as you get higher and higher on the data scale, that's when suddenly you need to jump into, or you want to start investigating neural networks and larger, bigger models, deep neural networks. But certainly when you're down in the lower regions of data, it's a lot of traditional machine learning algorithms will typically outperform because they've got a lot of compute intelligence and a lot of understanding of the data going into it. So what makes a good machine learning problem? There are a lot of cases where machine learning isn't necessarily the best approach, but I tend to find that good machine learning problems are where human expertise doesn't exist, or that expertise does exist, but it's very difficult to explain. So a good example, an intuitive one of how you can't explain your expertise is the fact that I'm fairly sure every single person can look at pictures of dogs and cats and can tell the difference between them. I think you could see a picture of a cat and say that's definitely a cat, see a picture of a dog and say that's definitely a dog. But then if someone said, but why? And you're trying to explain that to an alien who's never ever lived on this planet before and has just arrived, how can you possibly explain in a purely mathematical way to define exactly the difference between a cat and a dog? Oh, well, maybe a dog has a fluffier tail. Well, there are definitely cats that have fluffier tails. Oh, maybe it's because cats have standing up pointy ears. Well, there are entire species of dog that have stand-up pointy ears. Maybe it's to do with the length of the nose. There's so many every single time you find an example or a way of trying to define it, you will find enough counterexamples that mean that it becomes impossible. But you can still, with confidence, look at a picture and say, but that is a cat and that is a dog. And so it becomes very difficult to describe in a way that you could implement into an algorithm how you would analyze an image to say that is a cat or that is a dog. Whereas just by labeling enough data and by giving enough examples, the machine learning algorithm can pick up that information itself and can understand. Another example is where models must be customized. A really good example of this is anyone who listens to music streaming services. There's a number of music streaming services that might have a personalized playlist that's ideal just for you. I sometimes use Spotify, and they make recommendations of the music that I like, and they look at the music I play, and they make very good recommendations, and they do a very good job. It's not physically possible for them to employ enough members of staff to look at what everyone has played every day and then make suggestions. So really, that's the sort of thing that needs to be automated. There's just too many people, too much data. So it really has to be customized to the individual, and it's just not possible to do in any other way. And the recommendations that they have are looking at what the content of the audio and also what other people that listen to similar music to me are also listening to. So they're doing it both based on the sort of the social network side, but also on the actual content of the music and doing spectral analyses similar to how we might do in Earth observation. When models are based on huge amounts of data, so this is definitely the case in remote sensing. When we have massive data sets, we've got tens, if not hundreds of satellites that are gathering data every single day, and data sets in Earth observation can very quickly become terabytes, if not more. And it's just not physically possible for one person to go through and to evaluate every single pixel and every single satellite image. There's so much data that we really need to automate some of these processes. And where the underlying patterns can be detected and replicated. This is quite important, particularly when you relate it to Earth observation. If it's something that you cannot possibly pick up in the data, if it's something that you don't necessarily have the bandwidth to represent the problem, it's going to be very difficult for any machine learning algorithm to do. If you look at it, or if you get a trained professional to look at some data and they're not able to discern it, it could be very difficult for a machine learning problem to solve it. It might be possible, but certainly the intuition I typically use is if it's possible for you to do it with a bit of expertise and knowledge, then it will be easier for a machine learning approach to do it. That doesn't mean that there's a hard requirement, but certainly those sorts of approaches tend to lend themselves more. And then you need to start leveraging a lot more complex machine learning approaches or get a lot more data to learn more complicated underlying patterns. So what do we need to consider? Fundamentally, as I said earlier, machine learning is learning from data. All we are doing is taking data and learning exactly what's in that data. Nothing more, nothing less. All we have is the data, and the data really is what rules the entire machine learning algorithm, the entire machine learning approach. So the data quality is of utmost importance. If we know we can't get 100% top quality data all of the time, that's fine. We need to acknowledge that, and we can start building in approaches to try and understand that we have some noise in the data, try and represent those challenges. Maybe we can put in flags to say that we have strong confidence in this data, weaker confidence in this other data. But fundamentally, we need to know what our data quality is and be confident about our data quality. The size of the training examples that we have. Again, if we're learning from data, we need to know how much data we have to represent the problem. And the more examples that you can provide a machine learning algorithm, the better it will do. Stratified sampling and class imbalance. This is where you start looking at trying to do specific cases. You can't have 10,000 examples of one class, 10 examples of the other, and then expect a machine learning algorithm to get it right, because it will find a cheat or a hack. And so it will just say, okay, well, class A is, I've got 10,000 of them and I've only got 10 of these. So if I just say everything is always class A and never class B, and class B doesn't exist, I've still got 99.9% accuracy. So we need to build systems that will either understand that I need both classes to be represented accurately, or I need to start sampling my data and making sure that my classes are balanced as much as is reasonably possible. We can also think about data dimensionality and feature engineering. This is what I was saying earlier on about looking at different bands and band ratios, where you might be calculating indices. Data augmentation is, I'll go into a little bit more detail, but that's where you can start manipulating your data to try and synthesize more data. So for example, if you had a satellite imagery of a particular forest and you marked out a particular region, if you rotate that image and then marked out that forest again, that's still a forest. So you can rotate your image, and then the areas that you've marked and not marked as masking out are still relevant. So you can think about ways that you might augment your data. So so that you can generate more data. And also, how representative is your data? How representative are your data? So if your particular study site is in equatorial regions, do you think your data can then extrapolate to northern Canadian regions of above 60 degrees? In a lot of cases, probably not, but it depends on the problem that you're solving and depends on the particular approach. And only you will know that with your domain knowledge, but you just need to make sure that your data are representative. And then your different machine learning approaches will have different degrees of freedom, and that will impact the number of data points you need as well. But in order to do this, there's a whole array of different software. Here are a few of them that I've listed that are mostly Python-based. And I imagine some of this will be touched on in some of the other courses that you have, talking a bit about Python programming and things. But this is just to make you aware of all the different software packages that I use quite regularly. And this will be in the slides which I can share. So that's kind of an overview of machine learning sort of in a generic context. And now I'm going to start talking a bit more about how we can apply machine learning specifically to Earth observation, and give it a little bit more context on how you might solve some of those problems. So fundamentally, EO data covers a wide range of domains, from terrestrial to oceanic to atmospheric to climate. And it comes in a whole series of different flavors, essentially, from optical to LiDAR, panchromatic, multi and hyperspectral. There's a massive array of different sorts of Earth observation data that you can use. And these are varying different resolutions, different processing levels. The point is, there's a massive wealth of different Earth observation data. And all of these data are different and need to be dealt with in different ways and processed in different ways. And that means we need to consider this when we're also applying this to machine learning. So machine learning for Earth observation means that you're dealing with massive data sets, often multi-terabyte data sets. And that can be quite a lot more complex in some other domains of machine learning, where you might just be looking at, photos of cars and bicycles and cats and dogs. EO is inherently massive data sets, and it's also much more complex data sets with multi-band, potentially multi-sensor if you're doing some sort of sensor fusion approaches. The data complexity that we work with is so much greater than all sorts of imagery and a whole wide range of things. There's also a lot of noise in our data that we have. Sometimes this can be sensor error, sometimes it can be calibration challenges, and also clouds. Cloud contamination is a very large one, particularly when working with optical sensors. I think I spend a very large percentage of my time just dealing with the fact that I've got clouds in all of my data. And so that's something that I'm consistently aware of and need to manipulate. The other thing with Earth observation is we have very few labels, particularly in marine Earth observation. It's incredibly expensive to get a ship out to go and sample in the ocean to take some actual, like, very high quality ground truth samples. And so therefore we have massive amount of Earth's observation, very few actual labeled data, which brings in more challenges. So you can't necessarily always extrapolate out, and so we need a lot of technology to try and advance this. And there aren't necessarily a lot of off-the-shelf solutions, specialized hardware and things like that. So there are other challenges, particularly in an Earth observation context, where we might be trying to learn a lot more from computer vision approaches. There's a wide range of different machine learning tasks or domains that people typically use, and I was going to relate some of these to Earth observation tasks, just to try and, again, disambiguate some of the terminology that people use. So when we talk about a regression task, we'll typically talk about learning some continuous function, or approximating some sort of continuous function. So in this example, we're looking at bias correction, but this could be anything where you're taking a series of input variables and you're trying to predict something on any continuous scale. So this could be, in this case, it's a bias correction, but it could also just as easily be a chlorophyll value. If you're trying to predict something that's a continuous scale, in machine learning terminology, it's considered a regression problem. We could also look at image categorization. So does this image contain a cloud? Is this yes or no? Is this X or Y? And in this case, we're looking at a full image. So we've worked on some cloud detection images where we're looking at entire scenes and just say, is there cloud in this image, yes or no? Are there any clouds in this image? And so we're just trying to do a categorization. We can take this further, and instead of just classifying an entire image, we can look at classifying every single pixel within that image. And this is called semantic segmentation. So we're trying to segment an image, we're trying to separate out an image based on some sort of semantic meaning, some sort of context. So in this case, we're trying to do some land cover mapping where we're looking at different terrestrial, different cityscapes and then forest regions and things like that. But the idea of semantic segmentation is just where you're trying to assign one class per pixel of your image that you have. Or scene, probably, rather than image. Following on from that, we have object detection. And this is where, instead of classifying individual pixels, you're just trying to find the objects in a pixel. So in this case, we're looking at trying to detect individual cars, whether they're driving down a road or whether they're parked at the side of the road. And in this case, we're looking at detecting marine floating debris. So we're looking at trying to detect plastic bags and bottles that have been thrown in the ocean or thrown in the sea from a ship-mounted camera. And in this case, we don't need to measure the size of it in terms of the number of pixels, but we want to count the number of different instances that we have. And in this case, we can also provide a confidence as to how confident we are that this is a plastic bag or something else. So we're trying to detect individual objects and count them and put a box around them so we know potentially how large they are as well. And we can take this one step further and do instance segmentation. And this is kind of a combination between the two previous approaches, where we both find each individual object and then we apply some sort of classification. We find each individual object and then we count the number of pixels that are within each object. And this is quite important, particularly when you get into areas where there's some objects that are very close together. So if we've got these two aeroplanes up here that are very close together, with the semantic segmentation, these might have been merged into one continuous space because the pixels are almost next to each other or very close to touching. Whereas we want to identify that we have two separate planes, and then we have all the individual pixels that each plane contains. And we've got a very similar example with these docked ships, where you might have some ships that could be merged into one long one, but we want to identify each individual ship rather than as well as all the pixels that ship contains. So that is instance segmentation. So these are a whole series of different supervised learning approaches, and we can apply supervised learning to a whole series of different domains where we might try and detect or track things through time. But supervised learning is also highly dependent on the labeled data that we were providing. So I kind of mentioned this earlier on, when supervised learning relies heavily on having some sort of labels. And so there's a series of different things we can try and do when we don't have labels, or if we've got very imbalanced labels, or if we've got very sparse labels. These are all the sorts of challenges that will quite commonly come up in supervised learning. And there are a number of strategies that we can do to approach this. So we've got some unsupervised approaches. So I talked earlier about some cluster analysis. We can look at weakly supervised approaches. Weakly supervised just means that you've got very sparse labels, and so you just pick a particular point and then say there's a lot of areas that you don't know. So you're kind of combining this idea of unsupervised with supervised together and merging them together. We have self-supervised learning, where you learn a bit more about the actual data that you have first and then apply it to a different domain. And then we have data augmentation. And so I'll take you through all of these in a little bit more. Data augmentation is where you can manipulate your data into different shapes. So unsupervised learning, such as cluster analysis, would be where you can feed in data with no labels whatsoever, and you look at the underlying distribution or relationships within the data itself. So in this case here, we can look at global oceans over a time series, and we can perform a clustering to try and identify if there's particular elements that stand out within those data. So there's a number of different cluster analysis approaches that you can take, but this allows you to identify that certain regions might have certain consistent relationships. Similarly, you can do some sort of signal separation, such as a principal component analysis or non-negative matrix factorization, NMF, where you might be able to try and separate out components. All of these approaches are based purely on the data that you feed it in. There's no labels whatsoever. It's just exposing the underlying relationships and patterns within the data that you have. Following on from this, we have weakly supervised learning. And this is where you can really reduce the need for full labeled data, but you might look at individual pixels that can be labeled. And so in this example, I'm going to talk a little bit about semantic segmentation. So in this case, you've got an input image where you're trying to detect some sort of forest region from some sort of dry land. So you might have an input image with where you have a fully segmented label, where you've got fully labeled data, where you've got all your different classes, and instead you could just produce some sort of weak labeling where you just pick one pixel and say, right, this is the only one that I have a ground truth for. And you can see this would be very effective in cases where we have very sparse sampling. If we're going out on cruises and we can only sample one pixel, we want to learn as much as we possibly can from each of these different locations at each point. And then we ask our machine learning algorithm to extrapolate up from this. Or alternatively, we can put the label on the image level. So in this case, we're just taking the maximum, the most common class in this case. So it's the most common blue, 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 and then, yellow, 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 and then in this case, blue. So we can then do it on the image case as well. So we then just are generalizing across the entire image. So we're making a prediction on the image level rather than on the single pixel. I also talked about data augmentation, and this is where you can manipulate your data to try and generate more data. So the few data that you do have that are well labeled, you might try and change it. So in this case, we've got some sort of original data. What we could do is do some blurring so that if there's some very close pixels, then we could maybe have some sort of overlapping interaction. We can also flip it and crop it. So if there's if you know that you can rotate your image and it would still have the same labels and everything would still make sense in terms of both your input image and the label that you've generated for it, then you might be able to flip it or crop it and choose the subset. Or you can add some sort of noise to the signal as well. And dropout is just where we remove a certain number of pixels and just say we don't have the data for these, but we still have a fully labeled scene. So you need to think, particularly with data augmentation, about the context and the project that you're working on. So certain data augmentations will be very relevant, but if you know that you're studying the west coast of Africa, and then you start doing a rotation, and then it would start thinking, well, actually, maybe the ocean should be on the east side instead. So you need to, or on the west side instead. So you need to consider what is a reasonable augmentation for the particular application domain that you have. It could be that certain rotations are relevant. It could be that a certain amount of intensity variation or adding noise could be relevant. It could be that I just might be adding noise and complexity to the problem that you're solving. So you're going to think and use the domain knowledge that you have about Earth observation as to what is a reasonable augmentation to make. We can also look at transfer learning. So transfer learning is essentially where you build some sort of machine learning model on one data set, and then you transfer everything you've learned from that data set to another data set. And so you could learn on one type of satellite imagery where we have a massive long time series, such as Landsat, and then transfer that over to a newer data set, such as Sentinel-2. And we can really refine it for Sentinel-2 to try and make sure that we've understood what's going on based on Landsat imagery, and then extrapolate that out so that it becomes more powerful than just learning from the Sentinel-2 data that we have. And this sort of pre-trained model approach can massively improve the results that we have. So there's an example here that we did a number of years ago where we looked at trying to detect a glacial front. We're trying to detect the very front of a glacier. So the image is down here. We're just trying to detect this edge front of this glacier. And you can see that's what this label is. And we're detecting this edge front here. but we didn't have an awful lot of labels, and these labels are all very sparse and very time-consuming to generate. So we built a machine learning model. In this case, it was called EfficientNet, and we trained it on just images, just standard red, green, blue images. So we looked through a data set called ImageNet, and it's just got lots of cats and dogs and bicycles and sailing boats and all sorts of different things. But it is one of the largest image data sets in the world. And we use this image data set to pre-train our model. And the idea is it's learning how it can look at edges, how it can look at shapes, maybe how it can look at circular things that would be eyes for animals. But it's understanding how to differentiate and what sorts of things are important, that will be important for a sort of boundary condition if you're looking at a boat versus a sunset. And then after that, we then took it and then trained it on our much smaller data set. So we what we call fine-tuned the model or refined the model on our much smaller data set of glacial fronts. And at that point, we're then able to make predictions. And these are the predictions that actually came out of the model for these two cases here. And we can see it's done a very good job at doing some of the detections. The results are by no means perfect, but in this case here, it's kind of continued on a little bit further. In this case here, it's not quite got to the full edge extent, but we've been able to use the concept of learning from large data sets that are pre-existing and translate it onto specific domain that we want using transfer learning. We can also use approaches such as self-supervised learning. And self-supervised learning is kind of a combination between the data augmentation and the transfer learning. So self-supervised essentially means you're trying to make a supervised task out of data that is unlabeled or unsupervised. So you try and have some sort of self-generating label. So this could be a particular transformation that you have that you're then trying to unlearn. This could be trying to essentially cut up an image into a jigsaw and then put it back together. There's a whole series of different self-supervising learning tasks. But the idea is that we try and learn some generic tasks that is quite easy to represent and to learn to do our pre-training. And then once we've done that, we can then transfer to a downstream task that we have a lot fewer labels for. And this approach, I think, can really take advantage of a lot of the Earth observation data sets we have without the need for hundreds of thousands of labels, which we just don't have. So an example of this would be if you have what we call an encoder-decoder. So the idea is you have an image and you're trying to then just reproduce that image. So you're trying to take that image, you're trying to compress the representation. So this is basically trying to squash it into a smaller number of pixels, maybe something a bit like a principal component analysis, where you're trying to represent all the data that you have in all the different bands in a much smaller space, and then you try and expand it again. So the idea is you take your image, you try and shrink it, you try and increase it again, and both the encoder and decoder are machine learning models that you learn in parallel. And so then you're learning this idea of, I just want to create this shape, but this compressed representation could encapsulate everything that's in your input image if it's able to replicate everything in the output. And then once you have that, you can start masking out parts of your input image, and then your extrapolated output will be able to then predict what's going on underneath these clouds. So in the parts of the scene that it's not being able to see, you can then identify what might be happening underneath this, underneath these clouds. So this is an example of what we can use for gap filling. And a particular approach called variational autoencoders, which is a type of autoencoder which is the structure I was just talking about, has been used. And this is to try and look at performing gap filling. So you can see we've got a series of different images where we've got some satellite data that we've captured with very, very few gaps. And we've learned this in a complete through structure in an autoencoder. So we're learning how to represent this data. And then we start adding cloud to it. So we then start artificially just chopping off sections of it and saying, okay, this has been masked out, this area has been masked out, and this area has been masked out. And then we can look at the reconstruction that different approaches have. So Dini offers a traditional gap filling approach, and Deconstruct is this paper here, where we're essentially using this autoencoder structure to try and replicate what's happening underneath these clouded regions. So we're understanding what's happening and then replicating them through. And so we're performing a gap filling where we're creating some random gaps to then try and replicate what might be happening in the original image. So that's a whole series of different approaches and domains and things we can consider when we're applying machine learning to a whole series of different approaches in Earth observation. There's a lot of considerations that we need to make as well. We really want to make sure that we get the best out of our data in Earth observation, especially because getting labeled ground truth data can be very, very expensive. So there are always going to be data limitations. You also need to consider the limitations of the sensors and the bands that you have. And if it's not physically possible to extrapolate something out of some of those bands, then there might be some real challenges in building a machine learning algorithm to do that. You also need to consider that you need enough data. Now, enough data, how much data do I need, is an incredibly complicated and difficult thing to answer, and is one of the questions I get asked quite a lot. There's no real hard and fast answer I can give to this, but how much data do I need? The answer I give every single time is that depends on the complexity of the problem you're trying to represent. So if you're looking at satellite imagery, and if you're looking at it and you can look at it and you can say, oh, that looks like it's a particular region, and you can do some classification on that data, that means you're going to need less data than if you need a doctorate and 10 years worth of study to be able to tell the difference. And if you think you could train a child to very quickly do that labeling of data, then you will need less data. So enough data depends entirely on the complexity of the problem and how difficult it is. You can need to consider your training, validation, and test splits. So when you are building a machine learning algorithm, you are labeling a series of data, and that's what you want to do to test your algorithm to prove how well it works. You also need to separate out data to make sure that you have something that is very independent for test and very independent for validation. So when we're training a model, we use validation and we iterate through, and we are looking at validation consistently. So we might use this for some hyperparameter tuning to check what's happening with the data. Only at the very end, when we've built an entire model, do we then touch our test data set. I would typically say for small data sets, you want 30 to 40% test data. For larger data sets, you probably less for your test. The most important thing is make sure your test data at the end is representative of your problem. So if you need to cover a whole series of domains, then your test data needs to cover all those different domains. If you've got a regression problem where you're trying to predict something on a continuous scale, you need things up and down that continuous scale at the extremes and all representing the middle. So you can't just take 10 examples and then say, oh, it works well on these test 10 examples when you've used 100 million to train, because then you don't really have enough test data to represent all of your problems. You need to make sure the test data set represents your problem, and then you're allowed to train with whatever's left over. I find it's often better to start off with a simple approach and then add complexity. First of all, Occam's razor, the simple approach is probably the best one and is the most explainable. There's no point in starting with the most complicated model and trying to get it to work for 3 months, only just to see that actually you could have done it in 2 days with a much simpler approach. So I always start with a simple approach, see what it can do, and then add complexity. Because if nothing else, that should give you a benchmark for what you're able to achieve. This also helps you prevent overfitting. So overfitting is when you learn too much from your training data and you basically just memorize the training data. And when you try then looking at your validation and test data, you can't generalize your model. It's learned too much exactly the domain you're looking at, and you can't generalize. You also need to consider how you're going to evaluate your model. Sometimes speed is much more important than accuracy. Sometimes accuracy is not just the best measure. As I was saying, if you've got 100 million of one class and you've got 10 pixels of another class, is 99.9% accuracy with class B doesn't exist? Is that right? Or actually, do you need some sort of balance? What are you trying to do? If you're going to go out and intervene and interact with something and sail a ship to go into sample in a particular location, you want to be 100% sure that you're right. Whereas if it's to potentially give some early warning systems, and you're quite happy that there might be some false negatives, then you need to consider that as well. So accuracy isn't always the best measure. And you also need to be aware of what machine learning cannot do. Machine learning is not magic. It's not, you can't just sprinkle it on a project and think it will solve all your problems. It really, really depends an awful lot on the quality of the data that you have. And so fundamentally, yeah, if you realize there's a flaw with your data, it's absolutely fine to be unsure about your conclusions and to question some of those conclusions. Some stats might be useful to help. Certainly don't train an AI to produce more data just because you aren't sure about your data or you know your data is flawed. All you're going to do is exacerbate that problem. So if you realize your data has flaws, that's a good thing. And you just need to make decisions as to what you're going to do at that stage. But fundamentally, you're building a system that learns from data. And so that data is what is entirely going to dictate what's happening within your system. And there are things you can do. There are engineering approaches and tricks you can do to try and work around some of the challenges, as I've discussed, but fundamentally, your data is what's most important. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?